Hello and welcome to Cognitations, a podcast where we interview cognitive scientists about their research and how it applies to our everyday life. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. It includes domains such as cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, modeling, linguistics, philosophy, and more. This week, our guest was Olivier Morin, and we would like to apologize for the sound quality, because we could not record in a place where there was no noise, and because we had to edit out said noise, a bit of distortion can be heard, especially in my own voice. In the following episodes, we won't have this problem, so bear with us, and we hope you enjoy the second episode of Cogitations.
We are today's host, and I'm Thomas.
I'm Jay.
So, today's podcast is about culture. Culture is everywhere. It includes art, the disseminations of theories or social norms, customs, the food we cook or eat, and so on. Culture also seems to be what distinguishes different communities, families, or entire countries or continents. Is it possible to explain such heterogeneous and complex phenomena? More than that, can we identify the cognitive, environmental, or social factors that underlie the spread of practices, norms, and ideas? What is it that allows certain traditions to survive and develop, sometimes for hundreds or thousands of years? And our second guest on this show is the person to answer all these questions, or at least some of them.
He is Olivier Morin. He is a tenured CNRS researcher at the Institute Jean Nicod in Paris. Previously, he led a project at the Max Planck Institute for the Sciences of Human History in Jena. He has published a book, How Traditions Live and Die, along with many articles on the topics of social cognition, its development, its evolution, on writing systems and on communication, and much more. Welcome, Olivier.
Hi, thanks for having me, Jay. Thank you, Thomas.
So just a general biographical question to start off. How did you end up doing research in cognitive science?
How did I end up doing research in cognitive science? So I'm a product of the classic French system of the prépa. So I did an AL prépa. For those who know, it's a kind of undergrad training that puts a heavy emphasis on history, philosophy, literature, and the classics. So, a bit of Latin, a bit of Greek, and that kind of thing. Not at all conducive to cognitive science, because zero math, even zero social science, zero economics. So I started from a starting point that's quite different from where I ended up. I went into cognitive science thanks to École Normale Supérieure, where I discovered the work that was done at the DEC. Initially, the plan was to do philosophy, but I was frustrated with the historical approach to concepts that was kind of mandatory if you wanted to do the agrégation. So the agrégation is the degree you have to take in order to be a philosopher in a standard system. At least it was 20 years ago. And, well, as luck might have it, that year when I was supposed to prepare that degree, that concours, the whole program was about Hegel and Augustine. And not just any Hegel or Augustine, but Hegel's logic and Augustine trinity. So I found that it was just way too far from the exciting thing I could read about logic and philosophy of mind. That's kind of why I've shifted. Long story short.
Now, more specifically about cultural evolution.
Sure.
How did you become interested in it after your studies? And what are the links maybe between cultural evolution and cognitive sciences?
That's a good question. So cognitive science really was an epiphany. I loved the topic the moment I got acquainted with it. And in a way, I still very much love the general research program of treating the human mind like a computational mechanism and making broad universal generalization and testing them. That's something I've always been on board with. Cultural evolution is much more of a convenience topic for me, in the sense that it's not a passion, it's a way to make the study of culture legitimate. So my original goal was really to study culture in a cognitive science framework. in the old days where cognitive science got invented, anthropology was fully part of cognitive science. It was part of the so-called hexagon, which is a bit of a myth, of course, but it was part of the picture. Things have changed a lot since then, and nowadays there is not much anthropology in the pages of journals like Cognition or Cognitive Science. Some cognitive anthropologist friends would not be happy with me for saying that, but I still think it's factually true, even though it's a bit deplorable. Now, the attempt that we were pursuing with Dan Sperber and his students, and we are pursuing, is to make the study of culture cognitive and to make the topic of culture interesting to cognitive scientists. Cultural evolution is a way to do that. It's quite distinct from cognitive science originally. So none of the main innovators of cultural evolution at the beginning of the 80s were cognitive scientists. They were mostly biologists, behavioral ecologists, anthropologists, ecologists. And what they wanted to do was using the toolkit of ecology and biology, mostly models, to consider the spread of languages, differences between cultures, and so on and so forth. So it's a research program that's gathered a lot of steam over the decades, and it's becoming a sort of very broad catch-all terms for people who want to study culture in a way that's heavily inspired by the hard sciences. And by hard sciences, I mean like mostly biology and a bit of cognitive science. So that's how we end up sharing a building, let's say, with cultural evolution in many of the things that we do, even though I wouldn't say that it's central, it was necessarily central to my research. Hope that's not too convoluted an answer.
No, not at all. But so what, according to you, would distinguish the cultural evolution from like evolutionary psychology or anthropology or behavioral ecology, who are all studies about culture? Or
That's a good question. Let's go step by step.
Yeah.
So cultural evolution initially was part of a big movement that tried to understand human behavior using biological tools. And there were two other branches to that movement. One is evolutionary psychology, and another is human behavioral ecology. So the differences in methods and preoccupations are not that big when you look at it from afar. But of course, we are academics, and when we are inside our little chapel, we see big differences with the school next door. And in that case, there are significant differences. So one of the differences is how do we treat cultural transmission? In evolutionary psychology, the idea of cultural transmission is seen as deeply problematic. You are an animal in an environment with a brain that's adapted to your needs. You go about your life trying to survive and reproduce and get food and solve problems. And you see another individual that does things and communicates things to you. There's nothing obvious in the idea that you should imitate that individual. The default should be don't imitate, just follow your brain's instincts or whatever. So if cultural transmission occurs, it has to be for very specific reasons. It has to bring a real important payoff. And that's the way that people in the evolutionary traditions tended to see culture. In contrast, the cultural evolutionists, they start from a much more culturalist vantage point that's inherited from the anthropological tradition, which is to take cultural transmission as the default, to say it's unproblematic, that it's kind of natural for humans to copy what's around them, and that this is the starting point we should use as a foundation for our disciplines. There was one big disagreement on this. Another disagreement is the place of ethnographic fieldwork, which for behavioral ecology is huge, and for evolutionary psychology and cultural evolution can be much less important. Last aspect is the importance of modeling, which was central in cultural evolution, a bit less so today, but still quite important. There are lots of minor, the differences that would be minor for a general audience that are a big deal to us.
In terms of like the other approaches to like sociology and anthropology, there are people in those approaches that would kind of reject like the use of these biological tools. Do you think that their methods and their theories are complementary to what you do? Or would you say that there's a real tension there?
Okay, this is where I put the diplomat's, cap on and
Yes,
weigh every word in my answer. So all these people I mentioned, the cultural evolutionists, the behavioral ecologists, the evolutionary psychologists, and many cognitive scientists on the side, they all share a similar commitment to a certain way of doing research, which is to go a bit quick, empirical, quantitative, and theory-driven. Now that last point is key because there are many, many parts of the social sciences that are empirical and quantitative. But theory-driven is a really big aspect of what we do. The goal is always to start from an idea that is as general and broad as possible and then test its implications. And the ideas often come from evolutionary biology in a very, very broad sense. It's not necessarily, if you dislike adaptationism, it doesn't have to be adaptationist. If you dislike group selection, it doesn't have to be group selectionist. There are lots and lots of flavors, but the broad framework is that. Now, in social sciences and in anthropology and in humanities-inspired disciplines like history in general, especially in our country, there are two reasons to reject this general approach I described. One is that it's not always straightforward that quantitative work is valuable. Since the turn to microethnography, microstoria, and qualitative research, there is a general weariness of quantitative approaches. That's one thing. And another thing is that the very notion of testing theories based on evolution is still heavily controversial, partly because it's biology and there are lots of ideological preconceptions that surround the topic. I may or may not get into it depending on whether we have the time, but also partly because it is theory and it makes predictions. And it's not just, qualitative or even quantitative description of what we have. So it's a way of doing research that is different in methods, in preoccupations, and also, quite simply in the kind of places where people publish. So there is I don't know how to qualify it, but there's a distance between the kind of way we look at human behavior and the way of looking at human behavior that's most prevalent in sociology or anthropology, to be sure.
And yeah, maybe just are there also real differences with evolutionary psychology, or is it much more closer to evolutionary psychology research?
It depends who you ask. So the way we try to do cultural evolution here at the DEC is really continuous with evolutionary psychology, keeping in mind that evolutionary psychology is a broad church, and certainly no one has to be obsessed with the narrow range of topics that exemplify evolutionary psychology in the eyes of the public. So we don't study mating, for instance. It's a legitimate topic, but it's not the heart or even art of what we study, really. So the way we do in cultural evolution, we give a lot of attention to the way the challenges of being an organism adapted to its environment has shaped human cognition, which is a way of doing evolutionary psychology. We disagree, of course, with some claims that are made in evolutionary psychology. You can't agree with the field as a whole because people disagree inside the field as usual. But yeah, there's a continuity here, I think. That's not true for everyone who does cultural evolution. Part of cultural evolution was really invented as a kind of strong response against evolutionary psychology. That's not the way I see it myself.
So after having talked about these very general elements, methodology and things, I guess we can just go right into one of the main themes of your research.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess a way to get into it is just to remark that, well, as we did in the introduction, culture is everywhere in a sense. It's very totalizing. And we tend to talk about cultures or culture kind of willy-nilly just in everyday life. It seems to be a very common sense notion. But then we can ask, so what precisely is it, and how does a scientific notion of culture differ from the common sense notion?
Yes. Well, that part of the drama of doing the work we do is that there is no such thing as a recognized canonical view of culture distinct from the everyday conception. And the sad consequence of that is that everybody has an opinion about your research topic. If you study ants or tumors or clouds, nobody thinks they know better than you. They think your topic is boring, and maybe, but they don't, they don't think they could discover anything you think you are discovering. So we have a lot of work, preparatory work to do to kind of construct a scientifically valid concept of culture. I've tried to do that. I'm only one among many others, of course. One big step in extracting this idea of culture that's kind of scientifically autonomous is, well, first of all, to distinguish it from the usual notion of high culture. So culture is not the culture in the sense of the Ministry of Culture. Another big step is to tie it to social learning and cultural transmission. So culture is not just any kind of symbolic behavior that we can witness. Not everything that people do is cultural. There has to be a room, a causal role to be played by social learning, cultural transmission, a transmission from one individual to the next. I would add a third ingredient, which is that the social learning in question has to be active over the long run. So it's not enough if I make some random gesture and you imitate it out of habit or out of automatism. That's not culture per se. In order to have culture, you need long chains of transmission that span generations, that can differentiate populations, and so on and so forth. So the notion of culture that we study when we look at cultural evolution is almost always quite thick, in the sense that it's not just any effect of social learning, it's not just social life, it is the transmission chains that emerge when people learn from one another. Now, this has become quite different from the everyday understanding of culture. In particular, when you look at the conversation of biology and culture, many times what people mean by culture is anything that's not genetics. It cannot be people's innate tendencies because it's cultural. Culture is not a catch-all, bin where we put everything that's not explainable by biology. It is a very specific phenomenon. So part of the effort of cultural evolutionists, and on this I am completely on board with the whole movement, is to take seriously the anthropological concept of culture, which is not new, we're not inventing it, but it needs to be defended and solidified so culture does not become the error term in biologists' equation, so to speak.
Yeah, it does seem like in the common sense notion there's this distinction between nature and culture that seems to be a binary, right? Anything that's not culture is nature and vice versa. But it seems like you're suggesting that actually it's not a binary, and there are things like imitation out of habit, for example, that wouldn't be constrained by biology purely, but that isn't cultural. Do you think so? How do you think, given your answer, we should rethink like this distinction between nature and culture?
Absolutely. I would even go so far as to say we should not abandon it, but we should put it aside for many debates. It's not doing very good work because, well, colleagues here like Daniel Nettle have done interesting work on the way that this nature-culture dichotomy is polluting many debates on all sorts of issues, ranging from, is violence genetic, or is eating sugar good for you? There's often a tendency to bin causal contributions into two buckets. The bucket of things you can change and that are under social control, and the bucket of things that cannot be changed and are part of the human makeup. That's maybe that's putting things a bit strongly, but yeah, we should be very wary of using culture in that way. Culture, the way I see it, it's a phenomenon. It's something that needs to be explained. It's not an explanation of anything. It's just something we see. We see that behaviors recur. We see that songs get transmitted from generation to generation. We see that clothing styles differ from one society to another. And our work is to explain that. But we have not, when we say that, we haven't given an explanation. We just have identified a set of things we need to explain.
Which is interesting because in everyday conversation, it seems like, oh, it's just their culture. Seems like a sufficient explanation for people. Oh, why was there such misunderstanding at the office? Oh, because the person is from such country, and people are satisfied with that. But I guess that's how science kind of goes beyond.
We try at least.
But earlier you talked about you mentioned the cultural transmission. But in your book, How Traditions Live and Die, you distinguish between the diffusion of culture and the transmission of culture. Can you go over that?
Yeah, absolutely. So cultural transmission is really the micro level process where I tell you something and you may catch it or remember it, and vice versa. So cultural transmission really is the scale of description where we look at how ideas travel between minds. Now, this is not enough to make culture. As we discussed before, if I tell you a joke and it's not very funny, you won't pass it along. If you just imitate some random tic I have, it's not going to become viral in any way. So in order to have culture, you need more. And that's where we look at what I called, again, it's not very original, a scale of diffusion where ideas are not just transmitted from one person to the next, but are retransmitted and retransmitted again. In the book, I try to make the case that the real puzzle of culture is not really the puzzle of how social learning happens. It happens in many, many ways. There's a ton of mechanisms that are, in a way, overstudied. We know about that. But the real puzzle is how to get from that micro level to the macro scale where you get real traditions emerging. And in order to do that, social learning is not enough. Imitation is not enough. Whatever micro mechanism you have in mind, it's never going to be enough because that mechanism needs to be active over and over again. It needs to be repeated. The tradition needs to be successful. It needs to invade a sufficiently large population. So a real tradition is born. And I think this is the real challenge for the study of culture, to identify the causes of diffusion.
So at the beginning of diffusion, there is, so if we understand correctly, a chain of transmission, and after that, after a sufficient number of transmission chains, we have a diffusion of culture. But so you talked about numerous mechanisms at the basis of cultural transmission. So what is there besides imitation? Maybe are there other key mechanisms?
Lots of them, and a part of the research agenda of cultural evolutionists is to do a kind of typology of mechanisms where information can flow from one brain to the next. Now, my agenda is really to resist that temptation to do a typology, because typologies are endless. We can always add a new mechanism. So every year there's emulation, there's the unconscious emulation, there's reconstruction, whatever. But in the end, what really matters is how these mechanisms snowball into bigger diffusion chains. Still, it's interesting to look at a micro level, of course. So the type of mechanisms I'm most interested in are mechanisms that are not imitative in the sense that they don't particularly care whether you do the same thing as the person you are interacting with or not. An example of non-imitative mechanism is argumentation. Argumentation is an important aspect of cultural transmission, and many ideas that we get from arguing with others. Even if we don't agree with them, we get rationalizations for things we believe, weaker rationalizations for others, and we change our mind in this way. Now, this is a form of transmission, a form of interaction that is typically not imitative. People who engage in argumentation, they are not here to mimic others. So this seems kind of trivial, but it is not, because in the study of cultural transmission, there has been a dogma at the heart of cultural evolution, really, that if a tradition is to be successful, it has to rely on some kind of imitative mechanism. And an imitative mechanism is a mechanism that cares about fidelity. It cares about me doing the same as you. It could have all sorts of names. It doesn't need to be called imitation. It could be many, many things. But at the end of the day, you need this drive to do the same as X. And the most popular illustration of that is the theory of memes by Dawkins, which is many people's entry point into cultural evolution. Now with Dan Sperber and many of the people here, we have really tried to show that you can build a coherent theory of cultural transmission based on mechanisms that are not like imitation. And this kind of overthrows the consensus that was in the study of cultural transmission since very early on, since the days of Gabriel Tarde, who kind of pioneered the field in the beginning of the 20th century.
So you mentioned also like argumentation, but argumentation and imitation seems to be pretty human faculties. So what about the popular opinion that what distinguishes humans from animals is culture? Is it right? In what way?
I don't know if it's right, but it's certainly debated. So there's a history to this question. And to give you a bit of background, many things started to change in the end of the 1990s, where, I mean, it had already been noted before that you have stable traditions in non-human animals. But these were kind of anecdotal and small-scale behaviors, like opening of a bottle of milk by a bird and other birds imitate it. But in the end of the 1990s, ethologists really started to systematically look at traditions, and they found not just one or two, but entire bodies of behaviors that seemed to be impossible to explain by genes alone or by environments alone, let's say. So it opened the door to the possibility of non-human cultures. I'm not entirely sure that I buy this, because I'm sensitive to arguments that say, well, there are many ways a behavior could spread and differentiate populations, even though it's not entirely explained by genes and environments, just by, wouldn't say just by chance, but just because the presence of the behavior is sort of positive feedback effect. And the learning mechanisms that are at play here, they don't necessarily need to be very elaborate. So the notion of animal culture is very much part of the discourse now in cultural evolution, and we really need to take it seriously. I'm not an expert on that topic, so I tend to remain agnostic when I teach it or when I debate it. What I'm really sure about is that the debate will not be settled by trying to see whether animals have imitation or not, which used to be the big question. If chimpanzees are capable to imitate faithfully, then their cultures will be genuine. If they cannot be, then their cultures will be bunk. Now, many people are starting to realize that maybe true imitation, whatever that means, is not very interesting ethologically, because in evolutionary terms, it's not very useful to have. So animals should be doing lots of things, but not true imitation. And maybe many species don't have it, but still they may have socially learned behaviors. And some of these behaviors may be traditional in an interesting sense. So my take on this debate is that I'm completely open to the idea of non-human cultures, although it's an empirical question. And I think it should be decoupled from the debate over capacities for imitation, capacities for conformity, and so on.
And so what could be the best ways to maybe to determine that some animals have culture or don't have culture?
Well, it depends who you talk to. So there's two very different ways of approaching the question. One of them is to look at experiments with captive animals, and the other one is field work. Typically, the field workers have a much broader notion of culture than the experimentalists, because the data is very different, and you can't really control what mechanisms are at play. You can't observe every step through which a behavior like nut cracking or the leaf clipping or whatever, you can't observe all the steps through which that behavior has passed. So for these people, the telling signs of culture is that you can't explain it with genes, you can't explain it in easy ways with the environment, and you can't find it in populations that are close by or rather remote, but have the same environmental and genetic conditions. Now, many people who are in an experimentalist framework would disagree with that, saying, well, maybe you have a behavior that is present in group A but not in B, but what makes you say that its prevalence is due to social learning in an interesting sense as opposed to just, that there was one animal who was clever enough to invent a behavior. It left traces of its behavior around itself, and that made the behavior a little bit easier to acquire. But possibly in another society, in another chimp group, the behavior would have been invented nonetheless. It's just a matter of chance that it hasn't arisen. That's the kind of debate people engage in that literature.
So we talked about like the representation mechanisms and other mechanisms that would allow transmission, fusion. But another question is that of how we select information, because it seems like in our environments there's just, in a sense, too much information. That seems especially true today.
Yeah.
So how do we select the information that we attend to?
Oh, wow. That's not a topic I've worked a lot on. And I'm just as lost as you are. I don't know how to allocate my attention. Can I pass on this question? Because I really haven't worked on that. Yeah, we're all. Okay.
So going back to the fusion problem now, just in general, what drives the fusion of such and such artifact or behavior, songs, movies, rituals, etc.?
Well, there's no general formula to explain cultural diffusion, but there's a couple of ingredients that are necessary all the time. If you look at things in a very abstract way, which is what I try to do in my book, the ingredients you really need are repeated transmission, proliferation. So the tradition has to exist in many versions that can be found in many different individuals. And in that way, the extinction of the tradition in one or a few individuals doesn't matter. Last ingredient is the capacity to retrieve the same tradition from many different brains. An analogy I like to use, it wasn't in the book because it was only, I only learned about it after the book was published. So I had this friend who is Orthodox Jewish, who told me that my book was just making an old rabbinic argument. And it invented nothing new. You should always listen to people who say your work is nothing new, because they're usually right. In that case, he was. So the argument is an argument about the Jewish faith. So the king of the Khazars, according to legend, Khazars were a tribe in Central Europe, nomads. And their king wanted a religion. He had no idea what to turn. Should I be a Christian? Should I be Muslim? Jewish? All these things seemed attractive, and you need a religion, but which one to choose? So he has a priest, a rabbi. It sounds like a bad joke, but it's a genuine argument. So he has a priest, a rabbi, and a imam in front of him, and each one argues for their religion and so on. And so the priest goes like, our religions was revealed to Jesus Christ to communicate it to humanity, and Jesus made miracles and died for our sins. He's an exceptional person. You should believe it. The imam goes like, Muhammad received this revelation from God that he consigned into a book. The book is very true. Muhammad is an exceptional prophet, and therefore you should believe us. And the rabbi says, well, all these are transmission chains from one entity to one person. God to Abraham, or God to Muhammad, or God to Jesus, whatever. But when Moses communicated the Torah to the chosen people on Mount Sinai, there were 10,000 of people in attendance. So if there had been any mistake in the revelation of the faith, anyone of the other 10,000 could have corrected Moses. And the key to the robustness of the Jewish tradition is that there were many people in attendance. Of course, this is sophistic, because who did Moses get the Torah from, right? It's a one-to-one transmission chain all over again. So there's nothing, I'm not proselytizing for any faith at all. This being a podcast, I have to be careful. But the gist of the argument is a good transmission chain is a robust one because it has many links. And that's the key to how traditions can be sustained over the long run. Now, this is trivially true, but it's very easy to lose track of, especially in cognitive science, where we study cultural transmission very often in the lab. very often using transmission chains that are A to B to B to C, C to D, and so on. So this Moses on the Sinai argument, I think, is very powerful, and we should always keep it in mind when we try to explain cultural diffusion.
Yeah, so like what we lose when we lose track of the fact that this very basic fact about transmission chains, it means that regardless of the nature of the transmission chain, what medium it is, if you don't keep track of that fact, then you just miss the Given this fact, and that it's the robustness of the transmission, we could think of some like those of this as random in a way. So what determines this, and how much of it is the product of just chance?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It's one of the questions where cultural evolution has made real progress, because the field has developed formal tools that really allow you to model in a very fine-grained way what would happen if cultural change were completely random. And one very surprising output of these models is that even when cultural change is completely random, it can produce huge differentials of success between cultural practices. A good example is first names. So some first names are insanely popular, and other first names are much less widespread. So a name like James or Olivier is very widespread, whereas a name like Violetta is rarer. When people look at that, when I look at that intuitively, I think, well, there must be something special about the widespread name. There must be some kind of reason it's successful. And in a way, when people approach cultural evolution for the first time, usually they do it because of mimetics. They think they're going to find out what makes some cultural items so successful, what makes them go viral, why are they so big? And in a way, mimetics has sold this idea for a long time. What cultural evolution has shown very conclusively is that you can get huge differentials of success by chance alone. And a big implication of that is that if you rewind the tape of cultural history, you might get very different results, and some items that would have been viral in a possible world will not be viral in another possible world. Now, I should qualify that immediately by saying that chance is not the only story. But cultural evolution gives us a very good baseline. Baseline is what we call a kind of null model, a model that assumes something very silly, very simplistic, and probably very false, and tries to see how reality differs from that. The completely silly, false, and simplistic assumption is that it's all random. The surprising result is that this silly assumption can do a lot of predictive work, and it can already account for many, many things. So now our job is to try to account for the rest, the things that the baseline does not account for. And this is where typically here in our lab at the DEC and at the Evolution and Social Cognition team, we appeal to cognitive factors. We appeal to the role of evolved cognition in favoring some cultural items over others. In my own work, I tried to use cognitive science to explain why certain cultural forms become more successful than others. A big aspect of this research has been looking at visual cognition. We know a lot about vision. We know a lot about the human brain and how it's sensitive to certain shapes. So, for instance, I did a paper showing that portraits that look at the viewer tend to become more popular and also more cited in art books. Another couple of papers looking at letter shapes and the way that the letter shapes that fit human cognitive constraints are more widespread, more popular, so to speak, than others. So the way we try to account for cultural success is by using cognition. There are other ways to do that. You could look at more restrictive social considerations, like is certain style promoted by such or such a prestigious influencer or not? And there are many people in cultural evolution who do that. Here in our team, we really try to focus on the most generalizable, most, I wouldn't say universal because that's a loaded term, but the cognitive factors that are the most reliable. And things like the appeal of direct gaze or the human brain's preference for certain kind of symmetries, to me, they qualify as relatively robust what we call factors of attraction, so things that make a tradition go viral, so to speak.
I see how we can test for cognitive sectors that orient our culture, but how can we know for sure when we speak of randomness that we just haven't missed some factor and that it's really random factor or pure chance?
Yeah, that's a good question. You never really know on the individual level. So if you look at one song that got big and seems completely silly, you will never know whether its success is due to chance or to something that you haven't accounted for. But you can answer that question at the aggregate level, looking at the whole population of songs for the year 2022. And the way you can do that is with a baseline model. If you show that the distribution of success for songs that you can generate with a null model approximates sufficiently the real one, of course you cannot say it's all due to chance because the model need not approximate reality. But what you can say is that any theory that goes beyond chance is less parsimonious, and so it has to justify its existence in some way. It has to make better bets. It has to make better predictions. So in a way, you're never really sure that your theory is true. That's kind of inference, how inference-based on models work. You never know that your model is true. It's always false if you look at it closely. But what your model tells you is that if you want to do better than the model, you need to up your game and you need to make extra predictions the model doesn't make. So that's how it works. We can never really say for sure this is the mechanism, but we can make comparisons and say, well, this mechanism is more parsimonious than the other one. In practice, we are all convinced that cultural change is not random in a fundamental way. So randomness is a set of causes that we don't know that. You can be perfectly deterministic and still use these random models. It's kind of a philosophical question what randomness means here, but you can be completely agnostic about the rule of chance and still use these models as a kind of baseline.
Does this have any specific sense beyond just like the methodology of classical statistics, where you in psychology classes they drive it into our heads that you have to that what we're doing is we're testing against the null hypothesis, and you're not saying that the hypothesis is confirmed, you're saying that it isn't disconfirmed or...
It's different. So it's different from null hypothesis significance testing. So the methods I mentioned, they don't necessarily use null hypothesis significance testing. And in fact, some of the people I have in mind when I explain this, they are very hostile to the idea of null hypothesis significance testing. And because the null hypothesis in a kind of textbook statistics that we don't teach that at DEC, but in some places on the internet, this idea can be encountered that the royal way to inference is to debunk the null hypothesis. The problem is the null hypothesis is almost always absurd. Like there's absolutely no difference between two samples. Is usually, a bit of a lame duck. So the way cultural evolutionists try to improve on the state of the art is to make null hypotheses that really make sense and that are powerful enough to make sophisticated predictions. Random models of cultural change are sophisticated in that sense. First of all, they start from mechanisms that make sense. So the key mechanism is that if an idea is present, it's more likely to be copied, and the more copied it is, the more present it is. And therefore, you're going to have huge success differentials for certain cultural practices over others. That's not really a problematic assumption, and it does a lot of work. It does very specific predictions. So it's not the same type of null hypothesis as the standard null hypothesis. It's better, I think.
Okay, and for the psychology part, so if our psychology determines a lot the spread of culture, can we, or has it ever been the case that we can compare the selection of genes with the selection of culture, like in memetics? And so do we have, for example, the more fitted or the better ideas that are selected, or the worse ideas maybe? So yeah,
that's been a temptation since cultural evolution existed to try to replicate, the word is apt, the successes of gene-based theories of biological evolution to culture, and have metrics like fitness and do with culture the kind of things that biologists are doing with life. Mostly it has not worked as planned. It has not worked as planned for many reasons. Some of them are reasons that are quite general to the study of fitness, which is fitness is extremely difficult to measure. It always works comparatively. It is only one, selection is only one of the forces at play, and as we just discussed, drift plays a big role, and it's hard to disentangle the two, etc. So these are very general issues with the application of these models. But there are also reasons that are specific to culture. One problem we have is that we don't have DNA. We do not have a simple way of describing cultural variation. In biology, there's a very simple way of describing biological variation. Doesn't cover everything, obviously, but it's quite powerful, and that's DNA. And you can, to a certain extent, as an approximation, describe evolution as change in gene frequencies, and it will make sense in many, many cases. This is not an option, obviously, for cultural variance. We have zero way to extract a sort of essence or smallest common denominator of all cultural forms. There's no alphabet of culture in the way that DNA could be described. And again, I know this is a controversial idea now, but it's an easy way to look at life, at least to describe DNA as the alphabet of life. We don't have that. So it's very difficult to look at culture in that way. And many cultural evolutionists don't do that at all. So in a way it's a kind of an illusory aspect of cultural evolution. Many people think cultural evolution should do that, but really it doesn't.
But speaking of the alphabet,
Yay!
You've actually
I totally didn't prime you on this one.
So another part of your work is on the transmission specifically of writing systems.
Yes.
And so we all learn in school, I think, that history, the official start of history, is when we first learn to write, whenever that's estimated being. But what is like the origin of writing? How do you think we started to write? How did that arise?
That's a big question. So it's the core of my current research, and it's a topic that I like because it really ties together the study of cognition, the study of culture, and cultural evolution. And I think as people who study culture from a cognitive standpoint, we're really out to have something to say about the evolution of writing. The way I approach this question is to dissolve the topic of writing into smaller topic, because writing is really many, many different things in one word. So the way people use the word writing when they ask what is the origin of writing or when did it start, it can mean at least 2 or 3 different things. One of them is using inscriptions, permanent inscriptions to record IDs. Now that's very, very old and certainly did not start with the beginning of history, the first civilizations. It's much older than that. Graphic codes and visual culture have been around for as long as we can remember. And it's not just cave art or tattoos, but also tallies, ways of recording information that are fairly sophisticated, way before we have calendars and agricultures and all that. So if you ask when did writing appear with that meaning in mind, you're really looking at the very beginning of symbolic expression in humans, and it's certainly not something we know historically. We don't have an historical documentation of that because it's much older than history itself. Another classic definition of writing is the representation of language with graphic marks. So that's the canonical definition of writing. So in that view, writing is not just any kind of graphic code. It's a graphic code that encodes a natural language, such as English or Sumerian or whatnot. Now, if you look at writing in that way, it's very weird the way it appears, because it really happens by accident. What I mean by that is that you first start using graphic marks to encode the sounds of a language only for proper names. And in some places, like The Aztec writing is one case in point. In some places, it stops there. You will never use these graphic marks for anything besides proper names. And it's funny because the way you are encoding proper names is very elaborate, and it has the potential to encode anything in the language. For instance, an Aztec name could be "He who fights the enemies with thunder." Now, the phrase "He who fights the enemies with thunder" is a complex grammatical noun phrase that it takes a lot of resources to encode. So if you're able to write down "He who fights the enemies with thunder," you should be able to write down "Today I recorded a podcast with Thomas and Jay," but you don't. You just stay with the notation of proper names, and you do that for centuries. And only much later is the capacity to notate natural language evolving into something much more elaborate, where you notate full sentences and so on. The theory I've been trying to push is that this is linked to the demands of asynchronous communication, which is communicating things to people who aren't there or to time periods that are in the future. And this is the thing that writing allows you to do, which back then was completely impossible to do with just speech. So I think that's the key ingredient.
Does this explain the fact that writing proper names appears first or somewhere? Or?
Not quite. I don't know exactly why that is. It's a big topic. I think it's a good puzzle for cognitive scientists to tackle, because the semantics of proper names and the linguistics of proper names have always been a big deal in semantics, philosophy of mind, and so on. And there really seems to be something special happening with proper names and the origin of phonetic encoding on the one hand, and on the other hand, something special with proper names and graphic codes in general. So in many societies, people invent emblems. Think about flags, think about held big coats of arms, think about badges. These are things that are about places, people, institutions, all the things that natural language would encode with proper names. So there is something special that ties proper names to graphic emblems in general. I think the standard explanation for the link between the writing and proper names is not very good. It basically goes something like, it will be too complicated to express those in plain words. So in ideographic ways, not what I wanted to say. It would be too complicated to explain those in ideographic ways using emblems and so on. And therefore we need to encode them linguistically. The problem is it's very easy, in fact, to encode these things with emblems, and people had been doing that all the time. So it's not an explanation that's coherent with the facts. So if you ask me what kind of stuff I'm working on right now, it's typically the kind of puzzle I would like to solve.
Yeah. So also that there are different kinds of writing systems, of course, and what do you think? Or do we know about what differentiates factors that explain why we can observe certain variations in the types of writing systems that exist?
Yes, we did a paper about exactly that, and there are many ways to describe the variety of letters. So this is work that I've done with the Minds and Traditions Research Group in Jena. A lot of it with Elena Mitton and currently with Yulim Kim. We use all sorts of methods to tackle that question. Some of it is just observational. Other methods are looking at data that's been gathered by linguists. A lot of our current work is based on citizen science with participatory app and things like that.
What is citizen science?
Well, it's asking everybody to join and sharing with your work. If you look at the website glyph.shh.mpg.de, glyph, that's GLYPH. If you Google glyph Max Planck, you will find it. It's an applet of the Max Planck Society. So that's a project where we ask lots of people to help us in describing the letters of the world's writing system. And the hope is that we get a systematic and rich description of letter shapes, because we don't have anything like what linguists have when they want to describe sounds. They have the phonetic alphabet. They have a beautiful toolbox that's cut and dried, and they can use it in a fairly uncontroversial way. There's zero there's absolutely nothing like that for the study of letter shapes. So we're trying to build that descriptive vocabulary. Going back to your question, we asked the question with Elena Mitton in the paper, what makes letters complex? So complex, intuitively, a letter like W is more complex than a letter like I. It has more detail, it's more elaborate, whatever. And there are, of course, formal ways to measure and describe that. And there's two basic answers to that question that both make sense. One of them is that it's about history and shared inheritance. So letters kind of inherit their complexity from their parent script. So if Egyptian is complex, then the daughter scripts of the Egyptian system will be also relatively complex. And another answer is that it's driven by the demands of the script itself. What we found is that the biggest factor by far is the demands of the script, by which we mean what kind of units it encodes. Does it encode syllables? Does it encode morphemes? Does it encode phonemes, and so on and so forth? So when we want to account for the diversity of shapes in the world's writing system, cultural transmission, in the sense of where does the script come from, what are its parents, what is its cultural milieu, doesn't actually matter that much. What really is driving the trend is functional, is what the script is used for.
So you also work on fiction?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So why, according to you, are we interested in fiction? Are they useful, or are they just appealing? In what ways?
The big challenge, in my view, when we study fiction, and I don't claim to have the final answer, is how it relates to other behaviors that we know in other animals. So the vantage point that not just me, but many others in this team use when we look at fiction is really an evolutionary point of view. And we look at fiction the way a mythologist would look at play or laughter or behaviors like that. I'm mentioning play and laughter because I think that fiction has a lot in common with these behaviors. Where if you consider play in the animal kingdom, play is a way to prepare for events in life by simulating them. And it's associated with special signals like laughter. And it also is specific to certain types of behaviors. So animals don't play at sleeping, they don't play at being sick, they play at chasing, hunting, and fighting. So there is a theoretical background to this. People have realized the proximity between different kinds of play in humans, play in animals, and so on. Another ingredient that I think is important is dreaming, because again, dreaming is simulates events. People can tell you what the dream was about. It has a content. Content is not illusory. We know that thanks to a lot of beautiful studies on REM, fade sleep. And again, it does not simulate any event. You don't dream that you're writing an essay, at least very seldom. You seldom dream that you are sleeping or that you are sick, but in many societies, people dream about chasing, they dream about having embarrassing social circumstances, etc. So the idea that grows out of this literature is that there is an evolutionary utility to behaviors that simulate important challenges in life. Now, I kind of disagree with the broader adaptive view of fiction instantiated by people like Marr, Otley, if those names ring any bell, that fiction is usually adaptive because it prepares you for stuff. I think the answer to why fiction might be adaptive, and it doesn't mean that all fiction consumption to date is adaptive, it means that it taps into a mechanism that's used to be adaptive for reasons I'm about to explain. I think the reasons why it's adaptive, that mechanism, are much more specific, and namely it's about a specific kind of events that you can't really prepare for by training. So if you consider poisoning, food poisoning, it's a very common problem, you can easily prepare for it by taking precautions and learning from your mistakes. Because you get food poisoning many times in your life, and it never really kills you. And so you can prepare, get better at it, and so on. But if you think about ordeals like a violent fight with a conspecific, or an extremely challenging and humiliating social situation, or a choice that commits you for the end of your life, like a marriage in a society where marriage is really for life, then you need to prepare for those things, and you cannot prepare for it by training. You can't train at choosing a mate for life. You can't train at fighting a very dangerous animal, because training is too costly and it might cost you everything. So the theory we proposed in a paper with Alberto Acerbi and Oleg Sobchuk was what we call the ordeal simulation hypothesis. And one of its predictions is that fiction should be about ordeals, which are events that are really too important to prepare for simply by training for them, so that simulation should be used instead. And it's something that fiction consumption has in common with play, that it has in common with dreams. We are not saying that fiction is adaptive right now, or that, we're not making any claims about that, and it's not really what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is using this evolutionary idea to make specific predictions about the content of stories. And what we showed based on that, what we predicted and showed, is that violent death is extremely important in fiction. Of course, you're going to tell me we already knew about that, but actually certain types of violent deaths are much more common than they should be. For instance, animal predators are very important. Death by firearm is much less important than in the real world, although if you look at American fiction, 2/3 of violent deaths in America are due to firearms, but the actual rate in fiction is much lower, which makes sense if you take an evolutionary view where violent death is much more likely to be hand-to-hand combat. So that's how we like to think about fiction in that paper. I don't think it answers really your question about is fiction adaptive or not. I don't think we can answer that question with the kind of data we have, but taking an adaptive view of the brain mechanisms that underpin fiction, whatever their adaptive value may be today, can help us understand a lot about what happens in fiction.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And so maybe what seems interesting is that there are more and more maybe science fiction or fantasy stories, and it doesn't seem that we fight against dragons or that we have magic powers. So in what way, how can we account for that with the simulation hypothesis?
For that, you need to ask Nicolas Momard, who is interested in that phenomenon. I don't know that there is so much more imaginary dragon fighting in, to be precise, I'm not sure that the causes of ordeals in fiction are so outlandish today as compared to yesterday. The fiction is, the way people die in fiction has always been impossibly weird and unusual. And it's something that people have noticed since there was a study, since Aristotle, since people have been looking at fiction from a theoretical standpoint. They're like, this is odd, because fiction presents us the weirdest and most implausible behaviors in very realistic terms, which I think the ordeal simulation hypothesis helps explain. Because a good simulation should be realistic in every way except the fact that the central event is not going to happen to you anytime soon, like a fire alert or a flight simulator. These are very realistic simulations of things that are very unlikely to happen.
What do you mean by realistic here? Because, for example, Star Wars isn't realistic. It isn't a simulation that's realistic in everything apart from event and quest.
No, sure. I'm not sure Star Wars is the best example for that. We focused on literary fiction.
Yeah.
There are obviously counterexamples to the idea of realism. Although, I mean, if you look at Star Wars, what makes Star Wars unrealistic is the idea that you have planets. Instead, if you tell the exact same story but you remove the idea of planets, you have people who leave a desert and who go to a forest and then go to a city. And if you change the desert with the desert planet, the city planet, and the forest planet, you have space opera. And then you have spaceships, instead of having cars. But if you look at the plot of A New Hope, it's basically Casablanca, the start of it. And I mean, they themselves agree to that, the George Lucas and his crew. So, okay, anyway, not sure that I'm so competent to talk about Star Wars.
And can cultural evolution help us to craft a better story? Can we advise authors based on that?
I would not dare to do that. If I knew how to do it, I would definitely change jobs and something more exciting and remunerative. So that's the thing that's going to give you my secret, of which I have none. So
You'll see in a few years when your novel comes out.
I don't have a novel in preparation. I've never had one. Only non-fiction.
Yeah. So stepping back now and just asking a general question about how can this be applied? Because apparently it can't be applied to writing a great novel. But are there other applications for cultural evolution? Can it guide policy making, things like that?
Yeah, it's increasingly being used as a way to improve policy making, and so my own work is not dealing with that so much. But of course, I read what's being done in the field. Many political challenges today are about the spread of certain behaviors, which is terribly slow given the urgency of adopting simple things like eating less meat or not taking the plane so much. And so this is something that cultural evolutionists have a lot to say about, because we've learned a lot about the dynamic of the behavior spreading among people, how it's influenced by social network connectivity, and how it's slowed down by cognitive factors, but also by more worrying things like demographics. Not clear that we can change the mind of cohorts of people who have learned their whole way of life a long time ago, to put it bluntly. So cultural evolutionists have a lot to say about it. Whether it's a silver bullet that can guide policy, sadly, I can't say.
Well, I guess I talked about all the themes that we wanted to touch on, but if there's anything that you would like to clarify or talk about that you think we've missed, or something you deem important, now's the time.
Oh dear, except that I'm probably going to regret many things I've said, and nothing should be held against me. It would be the usual caveat for a podcast. If anything I said was wrong, please go to the books and papers, which is where the authentic version of everything is. And thanks you guys for your amazing questions. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. And one last thing too. Do you have any media recommendations, be it books, be it movies, or anything that kind of reflects the themes we've discussed today? There's a kind of fun.
I should have prepared that one. I haven't. No, because when we did the Many Minds podcast with Kenzie, we had prepared recommendations that were really nice, and I don't have them. Sorry. Okay.
Well, this has been Cognitions, a cognitive science podcast. We've been chatting with Olivier Morin. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Olivier.
On the next episode of Cognitions, we will chat with Dr. Frédéric de Vignemont about the sense of self, bodily awareness, and prosthetics. If you have ever wondered about how the mind knows the body, this episode is not to be missed.